the Constitution is not a charter of liberty from government to people, but a charter of power from people to government.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and for you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
I'm Catherine O'Donnell. I'm professor of history at Arizona State University. So I'm here in Tempe, Arizona today. Very happy to be here. Tony?
I'm Tony Stevenson. I'm a resident at the Township Senior Living in Battlefield, Missouri, and I'm equally happy to be here. Why is it that we celebrate the 4th of July?
Yeah, good question. And I think sometimes we imagine we're celebrating the achievement of something with the 4th of July, but what we're really celebrating is the start of something, the start of an effort. So colonists had met in Philadelphia in sort of congressional session. And by late June, early July of 1776, they had finally decided that it was time to declare independence, which just really meant to say, we agree we want to be independent. It's not as if this was going to convince Great Britain that this was a good idea. So the declaration had been drafted in committee. And in fact, it was kind of announced on June 2nd. It was July 2nd. It was discussed on July 3rd. But July 4th is when a lot of the signatures were placed. And so that's the date that stuck. But I always tell students that one of the founders I kind of have a heart for, because he always had good principles, but he was always slightly off kilter, John Adams. He wrote to his wife, Abigail, and he said, "This is a day that will live forever. We'll celebrate it with bonfires and illuminations." And he said, "It's July 3rd. So he was almost right, but not quite. But I think that gives you a sense of how long a process this was that we're celebrating.
Okay, that's very good. Do you think most colonists agreed upon the American Revolution when it started?
So I would say to you, do you think most people ever agree on anything, even like what to have for dinner, let alone whether to risk our lives in honor to go to war? And that was the case here. And even at the time, people estimated that maybe a third of the colonists actively supported independence and thought that Americans were better off on their own. A third of the colonists actively thought this was the worst idea anybody ever had. And they were committed loyalists, loyal to the crown. And then about a third of people, as one might expect, either didn't know or just wanted to keep their heads down for a while and see how things played out. So the war itself was a process of winning hearts and minds over to the cause of independence, rather than just a war for independence.
Right. So sounds kind of like the present day, doesn't it? Seems like there's about a little bit of polarization then as well as now.
I would say it does feel familiar. Yes.
Right.
Americans have always argued.
So do you think most of the American colonists wanted to keep the king? Did we want to replace it with a new type of government?
Yeah, that's a question that's really interesting to think about. And historians have this kind of shorthand way of saying it. Was it a war just about home rule, or was it also a war about who should rule at home? Right. And for some colonists, really all that they wanted to do was kind of lop off, maybe a nasty gesture, not the head, but the top layer, right? Just sort of remove the colonies from king and parliament, and then carry on, right? Just carry on as before. But a lot of other colonists thought that the revolution was an opportunity to try to change society in deeper ways. So some resented the fact that some people in states such as New York, for example, just own huge amounts of land, right? And other people owned very few. Some people in cities thought that like artisans, craftspeople, should have the right to vote, which they did not unless they had a certain amount of property. So it's kind of a mix, right, of people who wanted a purely one we might think of like classically political revolution that was just about the structure of government, and other people who had a little bit more of a social revolution in mind.
Okay, very good. I think we're all aware that history has, for lack of a better term, been whitewashed. Is that, we as historians sometimes have ignored the part that slaves, African Americans, blacks have played in American history. What role did slaves, African Americans, play in the American Revolution?
Yeah, I really appreciate the way you phrase that. And it's true, sometimes even when we are thinking about slavery and enslaved people, we just think about the Civil War, right? We don't think about their role in the founding of the nation. In fact, enslaved people are kind of everywhere in the revolutionary story. So on the one hand, some did fight for the Patriots, and this also included some free African Americans, which is your kind of the wording of your question alluded to. There were, right? There were free African Americans, particularly in the northern colonies, although there were some in the southern colonies as well. And some fought for the Patriots. There was one who fought so bravely at Bunker Hill that about a dozen of the people who saw it, whites, petitioned the legislature to honor him. So, and there were other instances of this. For a lot of enslaved people, though, pursuing liberty meant fighting for the British, not fighting for the Patriots. And that just goes to show how complicated any situation is. And what happened was, first the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, and then others, offered freedom to enslaved people if they would fight for the British. And this wasn't just an idea that popped into Dunmore's head as he sat in his lovely home, which you can still see in Colonial Williamsburg. In fact, enslaved people had come to him with this idea repeatedly and said, here's where you can find some labor. And so he made that offer, others made that offer. And in fact, enslaved people, including some women, risked their lives to get to the British lines. So it's just a very deep and interesting part of this story. As the revolution ended, some of those people who had survived, and some died, the British did not inoculate them against smallpox, for example. They faced even greater risks in some cases than others. But the British didn't abandon all of them. And some were evacuated to Canada. And you have towns in Nova Scotia that were founded by Black loyalists, and that still hold that part of their history very close to their hearts. So an interesting connection between the US and Canada.
Okay. So in that regard, slave owners during the American Revolution, did they try to influence the course of the revolution? What was their influence?
Yeah, I imagine that you've thought about, right? People have been thinking about kind of how slavery is part of American history lately, and this is one example of that. So in my view, kind of history is never either or, it's usually yes and that's certainly true here. So you have people who enslaved other people: Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison, and you also have those people espousing liberty and working to expand liberty in real ways for many people. All of that is true. One of the tragic parts of the revolution is that the question of whether the United States, conceived in liberty, should be a slaveholding society was engaged from time to time. It's not the case that no one back then knew this was wrong, or that no one back then said this was hypocritical. A lot of people did. A lot of people, including some slaveholders, were really troubled by the contradiction between what Americans said they were basing the nation on and the fact that they enslaved other Americans. But for a variety of reasons, social, economic, political, personal, and I'm not saying excuses, right? I'm saying reasons. For a variety of reasons, that moment of possibility was not pursued, and slavery does become codified in the Constitution.
Okay. So let's kind of shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about the writing of the Constitution. That's a favorite topic of mine. I love talking about that. I've always been amazed that the founding fathers were able to clarify their ideas so succinctly in the Constitution. So what was their thinking?
So I'm going to turn this back on you a little, since you have said that this is one of your favorite periods of history and you've thought a lot about it. What do you think? I totally agree with you. Like, I joke that the Constitution is shorter than some of the syllabi I put together for my classes, and I'm just amazed at that skill. So what are some elements that you think were crucial?
Well, of course, I'm, as you are, we're both aware that the framers were primarily students of the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
And it was such a shift from the Middle Ages. And yet I'm always struck by the fact that they were no further removed from the Middle Ages than we are removed from the Constitutional Convention. So it's amazing to me that they were to come up with this novel, brand new idea. I mean, obviously they got elements from the old Greek democracy of Athens. Madison, of course, was a student of the Roman Republic, obviously. But to be able to put it all together in such a small document, the Constitution's rather small when you look at other constitutions of other countries, that they were able to do this, and yet it's still able to govern such a complex country that has expanded and changed so rapidly over those 250 years. It just amazes me that we're able to do this.
Yeah, well, here. Well said. I agree. And it is remarkable kind of the way that intellectual pursuits and almost a kind of anthropological set of questions about why people do things were hotwired to very practical ways of designing legislatures, right? So it's not as if, well, there's the theory of government and the practice of government, and they're very separate. This was a moment at which I think people quite productively thought about the theory and practice of government together. And that might be some of the success. And also, I think the brevity of it does reflect the framers' understanding that they were not going to spell out everything forever. And perhaps the fact that they were revolutionaries, something we forget, right? Like we think of them almost like dad, and but they were revolutionaries, right? These were problematic people if you were Great Britain. And so they understood that things change, right? They understood that for something to persist, it probably had to be flexible rather than brittle. And I think that is also reflected in the Constitution.
Right. Very well put. Okay. this kind of really gets us to modern times, and it couldn't have happened at a better time. There's two viewpoints, I think, about the Constitution. It's a living document. As you said, it's flexible. It can be interpreted, within the modern scope. And there's those that say, no, the Constitution was written in precise language. The framers obviously intended it for the change, but they put an amendment process in. So is the Constitution, what is your thinking? Should it be viewed as a living document? Should it be viewed as a document that, was written in such precise language that that's what the framers thought?
Yeah. I like that you said, what is your thinking rather than what is the answer? Because what I'm offering you is like one historian, one citizen's view. So I think of it as much more of a living document, and for two reasons. The first is that the Constitution is a record of argument as much as it is a record of agreement. So that framers themselves did not hold a single viewpoint over what the government should look like. And even when they agreed on what it should look like, they didn't hold a single viewpoint as to why. And they knew themselves well enough to nail the windows shut as they debated, so that people outside would not hear, right? Like would not hear all these disagreements. And also so that somebody like Hamilton wouldn't stand by the window, make speeches just so people outside could hear what he was saying. So because it is not, something that came down from the mountain, but the record of productive disagreement, it should continue to allow for productive disagreement, right? So that's one thing I would say about the Constitution. And then the other is what we alluded to earlier, which is that it is built with an understanding of its own need for amendment, right? So that it has an amendment process. Okay, so being an academic, I realize I have three things to say, not two. So I'll just throw in the third thing really quickly. And that is, in all seriousness, there are elements of of the original Constitution which no one now defends. Slavery is written into the original Constitution, not the word, right? Because the framers were embarrassed enough about the word to use all kinds of circumlocutions to get around it. But the reality of it was, no one thinks that was an appropriate embodiment of American ideals. And if we're willing to acknowledge that something that profound needed to be changed about the document, then it escapes me why we're not willing to consider that our understanding of humanity, of justice, has also changed in other ways, right? And the country should need to be able to change in those ways too. So, but what's your thinking?
Well, I agree 100%. I like what you said about the Constitution being flexible, not brittle. I think that's a very good way of putting it. I guess I'm a little bit of a pragmatist. I totally understand the desires for people to interpret the Constitution in a more modern tone, and it needs to be. Obviously, the framers could not have envisioned this society. I mean, I can't envision this society from 50 years ago. I mean, it's so changed so rapidly. So I understand the need to do that. On the other hand, I want to make sure that we don't cross a boundary of legislating, from the bench as opposed to interpreting. And I think that's a concern that people on one end of the spectrum have, as opposed to maybe the other view. So it's a concern out there, but I do agree that the Constitution has to be flexible. It cannot be looked totally, from a lens of the past. It can't be. We're not a country of the past. We're a country of the present.
Yeah. Yes, and I take your point very much, so that the Constitution is flexible, but not infinitely flexible, right? It's not just a Rorschach test. And in order for there to be some kind of stability and predictability, right, of law, it does make sense for it to be used as a structure, which means that sometimes the Constitution may slow or even prevent movement in some ways that people would want. Yeah, interesting.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Bill of Rights and the amendments. Why were the Bill of Rights added?
I love the story of the Bill of Rights. So there was not a Bill of Rights, right? Originally, this is why they're the first 10 amendments or the first 10 changes to the Constitution. And part of the reason for that is Madison. Madison, known as the father of the Constitution, and really just a kind of intellectual workhorse, a little tiny 5'3", soft-spoken, intellectual powerhouse. And he objected to the idea of a Bill of Rights on logical grounds. And his argument was, we did all this work to make sure that the Constitution is not a charter of liberty from government to people, but a charter of power from people to government, right? By which he meant, if the Constitution does not say the government can do something, the government cannot do it. And that's because power emerges from the people and is given up carefully to government. Power does not reside in a monarch or a parliament or legislature, and then liberty given out, graciously to the people. So Madison says, if that's given that that's the logic of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights reverses that. The Bill of Rights says government cannot do this, right? Government cannot infringe people's right to assemble, government. And so it creates a problem of enumeration, right? Well, if our rights aren't enumerated, does that mean that government can take them away from us? So Madison objected on logical grounds, and he may have been right if we were all James Madison, but we're not. Some of the other framers, including Thomas Jefferson, sort of conveyed to him, James, that's just not the way the world works. People are going to want a kind of list of their rights. And there was a history of that. Virginia had such a thing. And it is going to be a kind of textbook of liberty, right? A kind of paper that reminds Americans what their liberties are. And that's in fact what the Bill of Rights became. And so much did people want it that in order for the Constitution even to be ratified, there had to be kind of a whisper campaign. Don't worry, we're adding a Bill of Rights, it's coming. And it did come soon. And last part of the story, Madison being Madison, after being convinced it was necessary, he drafted the first draft of it, and then he wrote the piece for Congress introducing it, and then he actually ghost wrote George Washington's thank you to Congress for the Bill of Rights. So once Madison was won over to the cause, he helped further it.
Okay. So do you think the Constitution is misunderstood today by most people, or do you think what's your feelings on that?
What do you think? What's your sense?
I asked my daughter that this weekend. I said, do you think the Constitution is misunderstood? She said, Dad, I don't think it's understood at all.
Yeah.
I
think that's right.
I'm afraid, that people have sometimes lost the desire to look at the documents that gave us the freedoms that we have. And, we've all seen the things on the late shows where, they go out on the street and ask the questions, and, it's kind of embarrassing, to say the least. But I know, for instance, I know that most people could not give a very good explanation of the difference between Republican and democracy. I know that. And so, is it misunderstood? I don't know that it's misunderstood as well as just not really understood at all. And I think that's a shame.
Yeah, I agree with you. And even when people do try to quote the Constitution, usually what comes out of their mouths is something from the Declaration of Independence. So that's a little bit of a confusion. I think in some ways, the way people who do love the Constitution can sometimes just brandish it like this tells you everything, or it makes people think the document is less interesting and important than it is, right? It captures the document in a kind of partisan argument. And I don't think people should try to capture it in that way, but I also don't think people should let it be captured in that way, right? The document is this flawed but extraordinary structure of American government in which freedom has been pursued, if not achieved perfectly, for hundreds of years. To your point, I usually buy little pocket constitutions when I'm teaching a big one on, or introduction freshman survey. I'll buy a bunch of pocket constitutions and I make sure that they're the ones with all of the original text right in it, not just the whitewash version. And then we sit there and we look for what's in there, right? And we ask questions about it and we have debates about it. And I've had students tell me years later, I still have that pocket constitution. And nobody kind of expects it from a university professor because again, the idea of a pocket constitution just seems like you're treating it as scripture. That's not what we're doing. We're treating it as a document from history that continues to shape the present, which you should know about, right? As an educated, as a person in the country, it's yours. Take it, know it, right? Be able to argue about it.
Agree 100%. So I guess we're getting near the conclusion. Do you have any final thoughts on the Revolutionary War, history in general?
How much time you got? No, I would just say it is such an interesting period. It is so fascinating. And all kinds of people, women are involved, right? Women are involved in the boycotts and arguments over it sometimes, and sneaking into the armies and fighting. American Indians had all these decisions to make about which side to uphold. Some questions that would not be sort of live questions again until the 20th century were questions at the end of the 18th century, right? Pretty radical views about church and state, about how public monies should be spent. It's just a fantastically colorful, dramatic period with all kinds of heroes, some villains, and then just lots of people trying to figure out what the heck is going on. So I really hope people read about it or watch YouTubes about it or like watch movies about it, ask people like you about it, who it's clear has spent considerable part of your life reading about it and thinking about it, because it is our history and it does shape our present.
You've answered a lot of my questions, and I know that I agree that we need to really be more focused on it, on history in general. I think that's a subject that unfortunately is maybe pushed into the background anymore, and I hate that because it's what made us a great country, and I think we need to look at it and always remember it. Pimples and all, flaws and all, it's a flawed country. We've not done everything perfect by any means at all, but I think we have to remember that this country is a model for the world. And I sometimes think we forget that. So, but thank you very much for being here today. I enjoyed listening, hearing you.
Such a pleasure to have this conversation and to learn from you as well.
And I think to myself,